Hello and welcome to today's webinar entitled Dopamine Detox, Separating Fact from Fiction. My name is Dr. Nigel Lester and I'm a psychiatrist and I'm Director of Mental Health for Palm Health. And this webinar is by popular demand. It's a topic that I get asked about a lot, and any cursory glance at the media over the last few years, you would have seen quite a lot promoted about this topic of dopamine detoxification or dopamine fasting. And you may be aware of books that are promoted by the New York Times best-selling list and interviews with various YouTube influencers and book authors in most of the mainstream media. But I think it is timely then that we have a little look at this concept of dopamine detox and see how useful or otherwise it could be in helping us achieve our own well-being goals. So let's first, what we're going to do is we'll take a look at, what dopamine detox is and what is being proposed in these various books and YouTube videos. Then we'll have a look at the scientific research that this is all based on, and see how useful this concept is. And what else we might do to achieve the goals that dopamine detox purports to achieve. Okay, so we need to start, I think, by just reminding or learning what we're talking about when we're talking about dopamine. So dopamine is one of the prominent neurotransmitters. So molecules that are used to basically send messages between nerve cells. And over the last 40 plus years, since about the 1970s, of neuroscientific research, it has become associated primarily with reward circuits, motivation, but it's also known to have many other functions. It's present in many brain networks. And of course, like a lot of neurotransmitters, it exists outside the central nervous system. It's one of 40 plus neurotransmitters that we currently have identified. So there are a lot of these molecules. The ones that you will be most familiar with will be dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine. But there are many, many more. And of course, there are also 50 plus hormones, which are essentially the same kind of molecules. They're messenger molecules, but they work in the periphery. So our body has a lot of these molecules, often in very small quantities, and just one or two molecules can create an effect at a synapse, for example. But there are many different types of molecule that are found throughout the central nervous system and throughout the body. Then is dopamine detox all about? Well, the idea that's being promoted is that particularly with regard to our modern compulsions of always checking off phones or being on the internet and so on, that this stimulation from phones and internet and junk food and all these modern so-called pleasures that we appear to have become addicted to is leading to an excess of dopamine. This coming from the idea that dopamine is the neurotransmitter of the reward and motivation circuits. And dopamine detox simply means that to fast from some or all pleasures, in some cases, leads to a drop in dopamine, leads to essentially you are decoupling yourself from your reliance and stimulation from dopamine. And the idea is that this resets the dopamine systems and leads to the ability to do the non-dopamine tasks, so the things that are harder and less rewarding, like reading books and writing essays and so on. Those become more, we're able to do those more easily because we're less driven by dopamine, which is the instant reward, instant gratification molecule. Now, this whole idea was invented in Silicon Valley, where it was became very prominent. It's on, as I said, on all the bestseller lists. There are several books promoting it, and it's been in the media everywhere for some years now. So, what's how useful is this idea, and what sort of science is this idea of us being controlled or driven by dopamine? What sort of science is this based on? Well, the dopamine theory has been around for a long time. It's been around for at least 40 years. I don't think any of us would question that addiction has become one of the great health problems facing our world today. Deaths from addictive substances, including tobacco and alcohol, amount to many millions per year, and the currently available treatments often seem to have limited efficacy. And so there's always been a major incentive to understand the basic neuroscience and brain mechanisms underlying our tendency to become addicted. So in reviewing the history of this dopamine theory, I'm going to draw majorly on a very nice review that was written in Nature Neuroscience by Professor David Nutt and his colleagues. David Nutt is from King's College, Imperial College, and has himself contributed to much of the research in addiction neuroscience, and so he's well placed to understand the history of this theory. And really, the major breakthrough in understanding the neuroscience of addiction builds on the classic observation and the seminal paper, if you like, by Olds and Milner in 1954, where they made the observation that rats would repeatedly self-stimulate areas of their brain connected with electricity. So these rats were, as you can see from the picture, they were wired up, they were kept in cages, and they were able to press on a lever, and that lever would deliver a small electric current to their brains, and that this self-stimulation was called positive reinforcement. Now, subsequent research in the 70s showed more clearly which areas of the brain were involved, and these areas were subsequently shown to comprise, at least in part, sets of dopamine neurons, which explained or seemed to explain why drugs that enhance the action of this neurotransmitter, and the classic example is the stimulant drugs, the amphetamines, that they would increase electrical self-stimulation. And studies also revealed that blocking dopamine receptors impaired this effect of stimulants, the amphetamines, in rats and also in monkeys. The part of the brain that we're talking about here is the areas in the deep inner brain, so between your cerebral hemispheres, where the emotional brain and a lot of the regulatory circuits of the brain sit. There's an area of connected structures called the basal ganglia, and this includes this includes the nucleus accumbens, the globus pallidus, and area of neurons called the striatum, so called because they look stripy under the microscope. But this early research in the 1970s was what placed dopamine as a central neurotransmitter in stimulant addiction, and therefore suggested that it had this role in the reward, motivation, and incentive behavior based on the observations of positive reinforcement. The next major conceptual breakthrough comes in the late 80s and early 90s. A team of researchers in Italy pioneered a technique called microdialysis, in which small amounts of drugs were able to be delivered to specific parts of the brain, and measurement of dopamine release in those parts of the brain was possible. And what they did was they gave a range of drugs of abuse and showed that there was an increased dopamine release in, as we said, particularly the nucleus accumbens of the ventral striatum. And this led very quickly to a generalized theory of addiction, which was that addictive drugs increased the release of dopamine, but that other drugs that were psychoactive, so effective on the nervous system, but were not addictive, did not create the release of dopamine. These findings led to an immense amount of investment over the years in research into the dopamine neurotransmitter and the dopamine function as a route to treat addiction. Although, as we've already noted, that perhaps disappointingly for these researchers, 4 or 5 decades on, there aren't actually any treatments that are based on manipulation of dopamine. In the context of the current promotion of dopamine detox, this idea has been extrapolated to other addictive behaviors. So we're not talking now just about drugs of addiction, but internet addiction, addiction to shopping, addiction to gambling, addiction to pornography, behaviors that have in some, although rather small, studies also been connected to these releases in dopamine in certain areas of the brain. The next technological advance comes with the development of in vivo scanning in humans. So the possibility of actually observing brain function in a living human being. And in addiction studies, this primarily relies on positron emission tomography, or PET, and single photon emission tomography, or Spect. These are highly sophisticated forms of scanning that rely on the biological functions of positron and photon emission from brain activity, as the names suggest. And they can be used in conjunction with radio tracers that can be used to measure the availability of the dopamine receptors, primarily dopamine 2 and 3 receptors, because there are actually multiple dopamine receptors, and in these targeted areas such as the ventral striatum. And so these allow quantitative radioactive imaging that can be used to measure the availability of the receptors and the transporters, and also the release of the neurotransmitter. So in the case of dopamine, there are radio tracers such as 11C raclopride for PET, and 1,2,3-iodobenzamide for Spect, that can fairly reliably measure the availability of dopamine receptors in the human striatum, and therefore we can indirectly observe the amount of dopamine that is being released. The more dopamine that's released, the more these receptors will be occupied. And so it was that in 1994, a team of researchers demonstrated that the combination of intravenous infusion of a central stimulant drug, so again, the amphetamine-like drugs, with Spect and PET neurochemical imaging of dopamine receptors, they could indirectly measure the dopamine release in the human striatum, and the magnitude of this increase was shown to predict, to a certain extent, the high that was produced by these drugs. So this then seemed to provide further evidence for the theory, and was interpreted as proving that the experience of pleasure in general, so the rewarding action within the brain, so the pleasure of stimulant drugs in humans was mediated by the ventral striatum dopamine release, which seemed to sit nicely with the earlier observations of rats. And a very powerful message emerged from this, and it seemed to provide support for this dopamine theory of addiction. So, as is often the case, quite rapidly, the dopamine theory of addiction became generally accepted based on these, albeit limited, observations, but very elegant observations using quite sexy technology. And so the dopamine theory is born and becomes generally accepted. If a drug induced dopamine, increased dopamine release, then it was believed to pose a risk of addiction. But right from the beginning, there were problems in the real world, in that this was contradicted by many clinical observations. So there were drugs that did induce dopamine, and it could be measured, but they didn't pose any risk of addiction. I mean, a good example of that would be modafinil, which is a drug that stimulates dopamine release and is used still to treat narcolepsy. And that despite the PET studies showing that dopamine release, dopamine was increased by this drug, this was not in any way correlated to increased liking or sense of high, subjective sense of high in patients who took it. And all the prior clinical evidence had shown that modafinil was not a drug of addiction or particularly reinforcing. Another interesting consequence of this was, of course, that microdialysis was used to gauge the dopamine stimulating effect of drugs, and many novel antidepressants were abandoned during the research phase because of microdialysis assay, in the fear that that they would become potential drugs of abuse and be problematic. It's particularly interesting because dopamine activity in the ventral striatum is not only associated with stimulant drugs, but also associated with resilience against depression. Also, in very early on, studies of alcohol, cannabis, and ketamine contradicted this basic concept. And as we'll see, the dopamine response did not nicely fit with these drugs, which were clearly drugs of abuse. But despite all these obvious inconsistencies, a prevailing view develops, and dopamine becomes very quickly dubbed the pleasure molecule. In 1997, it has the official stamp of approval by appearing in the mainstream media, which generally means that a theory has arrived, and Time magazine had a story about dopamine and addiction on its front cover, and basically repeated the positive findings that supported the idea of dopamine being the pleasure molecule and being at the root of compulsion and addiction, despite the fact that already we can see that there are inconsistencies. Further research showed that, as we said, that other clearly abused drugs did not inevitably induce dopamine release. And unlike the stimulants, an association between striatal dopamine release and pleasure, or the hedonic effect of substances, was less apparent for other drugs. For example, there was no relationship between increased striatal dopamine release and any behavioral, subjective, or physiological effects of cannabis. And in the case of alcohol, whilst impulsivity and intoxication were associated with, to some extent, with dopamine levels, the sense of high was not. And also throwing a spanner in the works was the fact that studies in rats showed that dopamine receptor blockade did not dampen the rewarding effect of some drugs. So, for example, opiates. And subsequent clinical trials revealed that blocking dopamine receptors was generally ineffective in blocking the rewarding effects of stimulants, the drugs that are most associated with this dopamine effect, or in treating, in general, addiction, even stimulant addiction. So dopamine blocking drugs have been widely available for some time. It is one of the primary actions, or at least it's one of the primary actions that we know of psychiatric drugs used to treat severe mental illness such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. But these drugs, despite being very effective at blocking the release of dopamine, do not have an impact, as we say, on the euphoric effect of stimulants or other drugs, or in general of just reducing the risk of addiction. And again, other drugs such as opiates were not associated with striatal dopamine release in the way that stimulant drugs were. So, for example, a study in individuals addicted to heroin revealed that an intravenous dose of heroin had no effect on striatal dopamine, despite producing a very pronounced euphoric high. And this study was subsequently replicated, showing that heroin reward is not associated with dopamine release. But again, despite all of that, it's now in the media. It's arrived, and we have a fully accepted theory. So, if we look at just a little more detail at not just the of dopamine being released, but actual dopamine function in the brain, we see again that the story is not the way it should be to support this theory. In fact, the story that we find contradicts the theory. One of the things we said earlier, that one of the ways in which we can indirectly study the effects of dopamine on the brain is to look at the competition with a radio tracer that binds to dopamine receptors. So the more dopamine released, the greater the competition with the radio tracer, which should show a change in tracer binding versus the natural state. But again, we find that the results are not consistent with dopamine release being the main mechanism or the main effect even of drugs of abuse. The little, it's a little hard to see, but the little graph that's in the corner there just shows you a series of studies using different drugs. So the most convincing effects you can see over on the left are the dark and the light blue, and those are the amphetamines. And we've already said that amphetamines, which were one of the first drugs used in these studies, clearly have a very powerful effect on dopamine releasing neurons, and that you can measure quite a degree of dopamine release. But then when you move over to the right, you have a series of bars. So you have the darker reddish color is nicotine, the orangey color is alcohol, the purple is ketamine, the green is THC, which is the active ingredient in cannabis, and then you've got an opiate, diamorphine, over on the far right. And you can see that what this is showing is the change in binding with the tracer with these drugs is not consistent, that in some cases there is no change, no significant change at all, or very little change. So in other words, what we're observing here is that dopamine is not competing with the radiotracer and therefore not being released consistently in drugs of abuse. Another way of looking at dopamine is to look at what's called the blunting effect of addiction. So it was noted as far back as the 90s that cocaine addicts had a very blunted effect on dopamine release, and this is particularly interesting in the context of the idea that we need to detox from dopamine, and that is that if you gave them a stimulant, which, as we've said, is the one drug that we know has a powerful effect on dopamine neurons, if you gave a stimulant to a cocaine addict, you had a much less impressive or a blunted release of dopamine compared to someone who was not a cocaine addict. But again, the problem for the theory here is that this isn't consistent across drugs of abuse. So there is a quite marked blunting of dopamine release for cocaine, and you can see that by looking at the difference between the percentage of receptors occupied by the radio tracer, which is on the left, and then the percentage of the change in that percentage when the individual is given a boost of stimulant. There is marked changes in cocaine addicts, but that is not consistently the case in other drugs. So what we see is decreased dopamine release in the case of opiate dependence after this stimulant challenge, and in alcohol dependence, a no marked blunting effect from on the release of dopamine is found with cannabis after this challenge. So these more recent studies have shown that the extent of this blunting of the striatal dopamine release may predict treatment response and vulnerability to addiction. So in cocaine users, low stimulant-induced dopamine release was associated with a preference for cocaine to money or to worse treatment outcomes. A rather elegant study of young people with ultra-high family risk of addiction who use stimulants occasionally but were not yet dependent showed that amphetamine-induced dopamine release in these individuals was reduced compared with those in well-matched controls. One interpretation of this data is that low dopamine release might be a vulnerability to addiction, thus somewhat turning the dopamine theory on its head. Instead of being the cause of addiction, dopamine might, if anything, have a role in resilience against becoming dependent, and may be crucial for recovery from addiction. But again, these are just based on a few studies. But it does, if you have a theory, you have to incorporate these kind of observations into your theory. And clearly, the dopamine theory is in some major trouble. The other the other thing we can see from these various observations is that, as we've just hinted, dopamine clearly has many roles, and we know that dopamine has many roles. It is generally involved in motivation, but it is also involved in a lot of more complex behaviors that come under the umbrella of what we call the executive functions. Executive functions include the ability to inhibit and moderate our actions, which again gives support to this idea that dopamine may have a role in preventing addiction, in actually moderating these behaviors or these discontrol disorders, so overeating, compulsive gambling, internet addiction, and that it is clearly a simplistic notion to consider dopamine simply the pleasure molecule. So here we are 40 or 50 years on, with a theory that really has not been subjected to the scrutiny that it should have been, but the weight of the observation is very much that the theory is inadequate, and yet it persists. We're somewhat addicted in neuroscience to this dopamine theory. We don't want to give it up. It illustrates quite interestingly one of the major problems that we have in modern science, where scientists have become paid professionals, and there's a lot of commercial pressure on science to produce usable outcomes. That there is an overall preeminence given to all the positive data that supports the theory. Negative data is essentially buried or ignored because it doesn't support the theory, and supporting the theory is the only thing that's going to get you promoted or going to get you furthered in your career. There's also this clear problem in science today where we've become a bit intoxicated with technology. So we absolutely fall in love with these rather elegant studies that use very sophisticated technology. And we forget that sophisticated technology does not equate to sophisticated thinking. We can devise highly elegant studies, such as the ones we've already referred to using Spect and PET scanning, that are extremely clever ways of indirectly observing something, and forget that no matter how elegant our studies, if our conclusions and interpretations are wrong, they're simply wrong. And the history of science is exactly that we make an observation that seems blindingly obvious, and as the observations accrue, we have to admit that what seemed blindingly obvious to us at one point is now clearly a misinterpretation. One of the problems as well with our current state of professional science is that there isn't a lot of encouragement to think outside the box. So if you're born into a world where the dopamine theory rules supreme, it's very hard for young scientists to actually question and think differently. Most research and most research funding over the last 40 years has been geared towards supporting the dopamine theory. And that leads us to do something that is even more confusing, and that is we just ignore ordinary clinical observation. Clinical observation is often dismissed as anecdotal and unimportant, but if clinical observation contradicts the theory, there's nothing, there's nothing unimportant about that. You have to figure that out. And the other obvious, thing to say here is that after, that even with this highly developed theory, if you like, of dopamine, we haven't been able to use that to create anything like an effective treatment. These kind of unifying theories that sort of pull it all together and are a sort of theory of the whole behavior of addiction, in this case, complex behaviors reduced to simple neurochemical theories, they are intrinsically appealing in neuroscience. In neuroscience, we are we always like the elegant, simple theory. But unfortunately, that leads them, as we say, to often not be subjected to the scrutiny that perhaps they should be. So, what does that say about the current state of understanding of addiction? Well, the dopamine theory of reward and addiction, which obviously clearly states that dopamine release mediates reward and leads to addiction, still continues to have huge traction. However, it's become accepted as universal theory without properly accounting for all kinds of findings in research studies in different drugs of addiction that do not support the theory, and all kinds of clinical observations. And again, as we said, rather tellingly, the theory has not led to any new treatments that would exploit this pharmacological observation. So the role of dopamine in addiction is clearly more complicated than the role that has been proposed by the dopamine theory of reward. Dopamine may have a central role in addiction to drugs such as the amphetamines, the stimulant drugs, which clearly act directly via the dopamine systems. That was evident early on. But it also is evident that it has a much less important role, if any role at all, in mediating addiction to other drugs, particularly, for example, the opiates and cannabis, and to a certain extent alcohol and ketamine. So addiction is clearly a complex mixture of behaviors and attitudes that will vary from drug to drug and from user to user. It is highly unlikely that a single neurotransmitter can explain every aspect of addiction. A more enlightened view would be that addiction is conceptualized as a multiple neurotransmitter disorder at the brain level, in which dopamine may be central for stimulant addiction, but other neurotransmitters, such as endogenous opiates, the GABA system, even serotonin, have important roles in other drug addictions, and that the behaviors and attitudes of the addicted individual themselves has a powerful effect. So the rise and subsequent fall of this universal theory of dopamine addiction serves to illustrate one of the Achilles heels of neuroscience, where we become enamored of addicted, if you like, enamored of a theory and unable to let it go. If we return to where we started in this sort of journey through the scientific research, back to that first elegant observation by Olds and Milner in the 1950s, we can see that there's a fundamental problem in the very extrapolation of this observation to human behavior in general, and that's the time-honored problem of biological reductionism. So the central idea underlying the Olds and Milner study is that the experience of pleasure can be understood in terms of activation of key areas of the brain. Pleasure, at least in human beings, is a complex experience involving cognitive, emotional and social aspects, and it's far too reductionist to look at pleasure in terms of biology alone. Not to mention that it's far too reductionist to look at the reduced biological aspect of it in terms of one neurotransmitter. Whilst studies using microdialysis and positive reinforcement are elegant in their technique and ability to isolate certain behaviors and certain neurotransmitters, we very easily forget that this is not natural. This is not the real world. This is not what we see when we look out of the window and observe the natural world of which we are a part. That what we are seeing here is just isolated cause and effects that we can demonstrate with our clever experiments. Another way of this is to consider the work of Bruce Alexander, a psychologist in Canada who, back in the 1980s, revisited a lot of the early work in addiction done by the behaviorists in the 1950s and 60s. And he made the observation that that there was a problem, a fundamental problem with the research, was that the rats that were used to demonstrate the behavioral responses in addiction were being kept in an unnatural setting. So the grandfather of behaviorism was R.F. Skinner, and Skinner the boxes used to study rats in the lab were actually called Skinner boxes, and these were small boxes in which a rat could be contained. All other factors hopefully could be neutralized, and the rat could be observed. The rat stood, as you can see from the picture here, the rat stood on a grill, could be seen from both sides through perspex walls, and only had a choice to take the drug or not take the drug, or press the lever or not press the lever. And Alexander just noted that that this was a kind of hell on earth for rats. And the problem here, of course, is that if your life is a hell on earth, well, maybe it's quite reasonable to take a momentary bit of pleasure because you cannot see your way out of this situation. And what he did was he repeated these studies with what later became known as Rat Park, and Rat Park was a more naturalistic setting for his rats, and lo and behold, many of the early work was not reproducible. The rats did not become addicted, the rats did not favor the addictive drug over food, the rats did not drive themselves to death by their addiction. And so the idea that had taken root from the early research that drugs were these monstrous chemicals that would take over your brain, and at which point you would lose all ability to take any responsibility and to make any intervention, because the drug would just take you over, as demonstrated in these rat studies, was not replicated. And that if you gave rats a life that had a little more rattiness to it, so they could interact with other rats, they were in a more naturalistic setting, many rats could not be addicted, and many rats that were addicted would happily go through withdrawal, and in some cases withdrawal from drugs can of course be very uncomfortable, and not choose to take the drug. And if we extrapolate that to what it is to be addicted as a human being, we can see that, in many cases, human beings create for themselves a sort of mental Skinner box. Life becomes something meaningless with no escape. And in that case, one of the major drivers of our addiction is that there is a sort of logic to taking the drug. 20 minutes of getting out of your head, or 20 minutes of total distraction, even though you are aware that it is overwhelming you and it is something that you wish you could stop, becomes highly attractive and very difficult to argue with when your outlook is such that you live in rat hell or you live in human hell. And that placing addiction in its wider social and environmental context shows that there are some very powerful drivers of addiction that are much more significant than simply looking at levels of a single neurotransmitter. So we have to be very aware of what it is to be a human being, and whether or not we are living in a way that satisfies us and brings us the kind of enrichment that we seek as a human being. Well, okay, I think we've sort of destroyed the idea of dopamine as being, the sole story of addiction. We've put it more into context. We've shown that right from the beginning, the theory of dopamine and addiction, whether it's applied to drugs of addiction, or more currently applied to compulsive behaviors such as shopping and gambling and internet and so on. That theory was sort of dead in the water from the beginning. It's been given sacred cow status and hasn't really been subjected to the scrutiny that it should have been. But, you might say, well, that's all very interesting. Thank you very much, Dr. Lester. That was a nice scientific review. But, isn't it still the case that that we can fast or detox from these behaviors? Isn't this just a way of promoting the idea of moderation? Well, I mean, it may be, and certainly I don't think anybody can argue if there is some behavior that's overwhelming you, like shopping or internet surfing or YouTube videos, that moderating and maybe even stopping that behavior could be a good thing. That's really a statement of the obvious. We don't need 40 years of sophisticated research to sort of state that. I think, moderation in all things was something that my grandmother used to say, and she didn't have access to PET scans. Obviously the question arises, even the promoters and many of the YouTube influencers and book authors themselves, rather strangely, whilst using this idea of dopamine to promote dopamine detox and dopamine fasting, rather strangely then claim that they're almost just using it metaphorically and that it's not to be taken literally, which does beg the question of, well, then why even go there at all? Why not focus on what actually helps to lessen these compulsive behaviors? But again, the question then arises: okay, if we give people a pass for their shaky and rather dubious use of the science, isn't it at the end of the day just a good thing to stop either for a day or for a week or for 2 weeks? Things that are pleasurable or so-called pleasurable activities that are overwhelming you. It might be. And I don't think anybody would argue that, if you want to stop, you should stop. But we should consider, in the light of what we've just said of addiction being a much more complex behavioral and biological phenomenon, we should look at what are the consequences of this quick fix notion, right? So at the end of the day, all these YouTube videos and books and so on promoting detox or fasting of dopamine, which of course we have shown is a nonsensical idea. You can no longer fast from a neurotransmitter, then you can, cease to breathe. But the idea that by stopping for a short term the behavior that is overwhelming you will fix the problem is also problematic. We have to understand a distinction here between the use of our willpower and the use of our free will. When we're using our willpower, it is as if we're hanging off the edge of a cliff by our fingertips. If we're strong and determined, we might stay there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, who knows? Maybe if you've got really strong forearms, you might be there for an hour, but at some point you will drop. When we use our free will, what we're doing is we're making conscious choices about how we live our life in accordance with what we really want. So free will elevates our choices and our awareness to a level far above simple willpower. And in doing so, we can begin to move away from what a lot of the quick fix solutions create in us, and that is this struggle with ourself. Ultimately, dopamine detox and dopamine fasting tells you that maybe the demon drug is not out to get you, but the demon chemical is. There's a problem in your brain, that you're broken, you need fixing, you need tweaking, you need resetting, and it sets up a very powerful struggle within yourself, and it appeals to this notion in people that they must constantly work to perfect themselves, that they've been born into inadequacy and imperfection, and that they must work to create the perfect you. There is this yo-yo or roller coaster of denial and indulgence, and it sets up a cycle of shame. You stop what you're doing and the behavior that is overwhelming you and causing such sadness in yourself and your family, and then you start it again, and then the problem arises, and you're on this roller coaster. It also has the danger of this approach is that it cultivates self-loathing. You begin to be shameful and dislike yourself. You see yourself as the very problem. You are a dopamine machine, and you need to beat this dopamine machine into submission. And it cultivates, very quickly can cultivate despair as you compare yourself to others. Most of the YouTube promoters, influencers promoting dopamine detox, they're these fit young people who are, down the gym and doing all of this to perfect themselves. And it's very easy then to compare yourself to someone like that, who is, after all, actually only a persona. You don't really know how these people live their lives, and cultivate despair that you're not able to achieve this goal of perfect balance of your diet, perfect balance of your dopamine. And this despair eats away at you and becomes part of the blockage. In other words, the danger of these quick fix, simplistic notions is not just that, as we've demonstrated very clearly, they're not actually based on anything that could be said to be the truth. It's just a little bit of truth. But they set you up. They set you up for an endless struggle. It's the sort of, Sisyphean world that you're being led into, where you will roll your rock up to the top of the hill, endure your 2 weeks of abstinence from pleasure, and then watch your rock roll all the way down again as you go back to normal life. These kind of mental crash diets are really no different from the other kind, the crash diet, the nutritional crash diets. And surely we have enough evidence of the problem that the nutritional crash diets create, right? They set up this endless struggle, a struggle with no end, and it becomes almost a lifestyle in itself. And, rather ironically, we can become addicted to self-improvement as defined by these kind of promoted ideas that, you must have the perfect this and the perfect that. And, who are we comparing and what are we comparing it to? Even if we could measure your dopamine, what's the perfect dopamine level? What's the perfect, even if we stuck you in a scanner, what's the perfect scan? It's nonsensical. I mean, I've seen some people promoting this idea who actually do EEGs, and they then claim that their EEG is so much better. But the point is that your brain is responding constantly. Yes, you can use an EEG to monitor your ability to create changes in your brain. That's a highly beneficial thing to do. The most obvious example of that is neurofeedback. But you're not creating a brain that is then static and doesn't continue to change and respond. Someone who perhaps put this idea a little bit more elegantly than I've put it was the philosopher J. Krishnamurti in the 20th century, who used the phrase that freedom is found in the choiceless awareness of our daily existence and activity. In other words, that we have to see that this struggle traps us, and that if we can actually grow in awareness of what we really are and how we really want to live, there is a sort of choicelessness about that. It is effortlessly available to us to live how we wish in our daily life and our daily activity, but that it is an awareness of that that will cultivate the freedom to make those choices. In other words, will awaken our free will. So one obvious problem with these simplistic quick fix approaches is that we are simply setting up a fight within ourselves, and the struggle within yourself based on all these negative judgments and comparisons, all these opinions, will close down this awareness of your reality and close down the ability to develop knowledge and make simple observations that would lead you to an awakening of your free will and make choices that you truly want. When you are, one of the ways in which I will work with people who have an addiction is to try to get them early on to think about, why the substance or why the behavior is so attractive. And it's very difficult, because if I say to someone, for example, who is a cigarette smoker, I'll say, well, tell me all the good things about cigarette smoking. And they'll say, well, there aren't any. It's terrible. It's bad for your health. My clothes smell, blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, well, yes, I know you know that. You're engaged in this activity, so you more than anyone else live that reality. But what I want to know is, what's so good about it? Imagine sitting down with your children and saying, look, I found an excellent way to cope with the stresses and strains of life. It's called cigarettes. How would you sell it to them? And the point about that is to realize that our conditioned brain is selling it to us. That's the point, right? We're not actually perverse creatures that are doing things solely because of fluctuations of dopamine level, or solely because we're shamefully born into in an inadequate state. No, we've been conditioned to see certain behaviors and certain substances as beneficial. Look at advertising for alcohol and you'll pick up 5 or 6 reasons why drinking is good. Drinking is sociable, drinking is sexy, drinking is sophisticated, drinking is pleasurable. It's all there in the advert. The advertising industry knows full well about emotional associations and brain conditioning. That's largely what it's about. It's about creating positive associations for a product. And so it is, we create positive associations with our drugs or behaviors of choice, but we never question it. And when we actually start to go into that and delve into that, we see that these positive associations begin to evaporate almost effortlessly as we deeply investigate. And we get away from this idea that we are simply victims of our own perversity or victims of our own dopamine, and recognize that no, we have simply forgotten the abilities and the qualities that we have as human beings, and that we can become aware of where that gets corrupted. So another way of conceptualizing this, and a way that I would consider approaching the problems of compulsive behaviors and addictions, is to start by recognizing that well-being is your natural state. We have to make ourselves addicted. We have to get ourselves into these compulsion traps that it is not our natural state. We didn't evolve over the millennia to be self-destructive. The species would not have survived in that case. That we, in our very outlooks, are corrupting the mechanisms that have served us so well over human evolution. That the problem with modern life is that we have created a very natural environment in which we have disconnected ourselves from the natural mechanisms, and that we are working against them rather than with them. On a biological level, then, rather than worrying about your various neurotransmitters, which have multitude of effects and are part of a highly sophisticated natural system of which we understand we barely have scraped the surface. On a biological level, what we need to achieve is calmness. Of course, it's true that our modern world we are overstimulated. We also need to cultivate a view of ourselves that is realistic. We need to see what it is that we associate with our addictions, what it is we associate with our compulsions. We need to look realistically. We can't hide or distract ourselves from that. Otherwise, we're just trapping ourselves in inadequate ideas. And through calmness and self-acceptance, in other words, a realistic view of ourselves, there is a natural self-awareness and ability to observe that arises that leads us quite painlessly away from struggle towards real lasting change through making different choices. So this natural state of well-being that we forget can be remembered. So in the case of substances, for example, physical dependence is obviously part of the problem, and in some drugs, there's a real medical necessity to treat that, and others it's less dramatic. But psychological dependence is often the key blockage to change. It's the fact that we do not see what we have associated with this drug, and we do not see that we can understand and question those associations. In addition, as we've seen by looking at Rat Park and Rat Hell, life with no meaning, other than perhaps this tedious, empty pursuit of a sort of self-improvement to what? To create the perfect Instagram picture, to promote yourself on YouTube, it further traps us. One of the necessary, if rats need, a naturalistic setting, so do humans. We need to be connected to what puts us firmly into a state of awareness of the meaning and the nature of what we are. And by removing ourselves constantly from that, we are creating a sort of Skinner box for our own lives. So let's look at these ideas in a little more detail. The biological basis of moderation lies in calming the emotional brain. But what we're talking about here is true relaxation, not recreation. I mean, there are many studies that say, how do you relax? And the top one is, a glass of wine and Netflix, or, read a good book. These are all, activities that you can enjoy, but true relaxation is that letting go of the brain's and the body's activity. We used to do it quite naturally. We used to gather and hunt for our food and make our shelter secure, and then sit down and lie down in the grass, lie down in the forest. And we weren't thinking about, the 200 emails that we need to get to, or we weren't thinking about, binge watching a series on TV. We were simply allowing ourselves to relax. Meditation practices that are used commonly and that we teach at Palm, such as silence of the mind, can help with this. Union with nature is another meditation that can help with this. Techniques of psychophysiological coherence, such as cardiac coherence, can help with this. These are breathing techniques, all of which are readily available at Palm. But also, since we do live in an unnatural world now, and it's hard to get out there and relax in the way that we have done for millennia, we can use a series of treatments, again, things that are available to us at Palm, like the biomats, the massage, the salt room, float tanks. These are all modern techniques that are used to recreate in us that sense of deep relaxation. But the important message being that regardless of whether you are going to seek to stop the overwhelming behavior now or later, you need to begin today to cultivate the habit of relaxation in this overstimulated world. You need to do this every day. You need to start with a little bit. So maybe you start with, simply having 20 minutes of stillness in your day. Maybe you start with, meditating, learning a meditation that you can do every day. Maybe you start by doing the salt room on a regular basis. But you need to start cultivating this ability to calm the brain. It's only when we're calm, when we're not in a state of agitation, of fear, or of heightened emotion, that we can really start to understand the psychological underpinnings of our inability to moderate some of our behaviors. And that lies in our inability to see reality as it is. Self-acceptance is simply the ability to look calmly and without judgment or condemnation at what we do, how we live, the reality of our lives. Again, when I work with people with addiction, I will sometimes ask them to, for example, someone who's addicted to alcohol, I'll say, well, can you just create a little diary for me? And just every day I want you to just record, when you have a drink, how much you drink. And people find that really hard to do, not because it's a complicated concept, because they resist it psychologically. And when I ask them if they've done it, and they say, they sort of reluctantly say, well, no, often the explanation is, I know I drink too much. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to see it. Because it creates in them an agitation. And of course, what does someone who's addicted to alcohol do when they feel agitated? Well, they reach for a drink. So you can see that we can easily get trapped in this vicious cycle if we can't just put calmness first and move towards self-acceptance. Simply record. Don't compare. Don't show it to anyone else necessarily. It's your information. But we're unable to progress, to make any progress, if we don't have a clear acceptance free of condemnation. Because there's always something we desire. There's always going to be this impulse in us to move away from displeasure. And there's always going to be displeasure. I mean, life is always going to bring stress towards us. Increasingly in the modern world, there's an endless lists of things that we can fear and be agitated about. I mean, it's quite a useful, if not slightly depressing exercise to simply sit down and list the things that you're frightened of, the things that are creating fear in you. And for many people, it might start with death, but for some people, it might go on to their various imperfections as they see it, their fear of being rejected or missing out or not being part of the crowd, on and on and on. And you can add to that list now the fear of too much dopamine, or is it too little dopamine? I don't know. Anyway, let's drop that one from the list right away, shall we? Don't worry about your dopamine. But we cannot be in this state of heightened desire or fear, or in this endless struggle with ourselves, with self-loathing. We cannot be in that state and have self-acceptance. Only when we can start to accept reality can we let go of fighting ourselves and take responsibility. Take responsibility does not mean blame ourselves. Blaming is another form of condemnation and struggle. Taking responsibility means that we actually can be the agent of change. We can make the choices. We can see clearly what needs to be done. Think about how you observe this in other people. Think about how you are able to often give your friends support and advice because you see clearly in them. And think about how hard that is in yourself because of all of the emotional, heightened emotion that goes with it, and because of your inability to self-accept. So when we can work on being calm, there is something quite remarkable that then happens, and that is we move to an increased level of awareness and a shift in our perspective about ourselves and our lives and our choices in life. So through calmness and self-acceptance, we can change spontaneously without the tension or conflict that comes from the endless struggle that we've seen in these sort of half-baked quick fix solutions. We become more aware of ourselves and the world around us, and we can distinguish between the temporary nature of pleasure, for which there is nothing wrong. I mean, life involves a certain amount of pleasure. But we can distinguish that from the lasting satisfaction we get when our life starts to have more coherence and meaning and connects more to a sense of our deeper purpose, whatever that is for us. We become much more observant. We can see our habits for what they are, good habits and bad habits. And there's no difference between a good habit and a bad habit. And we can cultivate the good habits and we can let the bad habits go. But this is a gradual process of awakening of our awareness that comes from working on our calmness, from building our self-acceptance, and will be completely blocked by a state of agitation, a state of fear, engaging with an endless struggle, the Sisyphean task of trying to perfect ourselves in the assumption that we are broken individuals inherently destructive because of either the drugs around us or the chemicals within us. So, where have we been on this little journey? Well, I think we've seen another example in the fad for dopamine detoxing or dopamine fasting. We've seen another example of this desire for a quick fix and the appeal of this endless struggle within ourselves, which is constantly exploited by these fad treatments. There seems to be something in us that is ready to be told, you're a bad person and you need to improve yourself. Even if it's done in a rather sort of, flattering light, ultimately that's what we're being told, that we need to engage in this endless struggle of perfection. We're easily shamed and we're easily led into a fight with ourselves. Biological reductionism also leads us to get a bit confused where we take just a tiny slice of truth and we think that it is the truth. It is how things work. But if we put all that aside and we start to cultivate daily practices of calmness, we see the value of simply cultivating calmness in our life, and we start to work a little bit on looking at reality and developing our self-acceptance. We can soon develop a deeper understanding of our habits, a greater observation of what it is we do and why we do it, the inadequate ideas behind them, which we very easily can start to let go of, and the inadequate ideas that trouble us, and we can naturally, without struggle, begin to find ways to transcend them. We don't have to do this on our own, and indeed at Palm Health we exist to try to help and accompany people in this way. It isn't going to be a quick fix, but then why would we quickly fix something when we don't even know what it is we're fixing? We've seen through using dopamine detox as an example that we might get very enamored with the idea of raising or lowering our dopamine when we don't really even know what that means. And we certainly know it doesn't mean that we are going to be living our lives more happily or with more satisfaction and meaning. It cannot possibly be reduced to a simple neurotransmitter. Well, I hope that has given you a different perspective on this latest fad in the popular media, and I hope that it may have inspired and educated you a little bit to think a little more deeply about the behaviours that you feel overwhelmed by, and start to think about all the possible ways and the huge potential you have to start to change these behaviours and make different choices for yourself. Thanks for your attention, and I wish you all the best of luck.